There's a lot more to food than what meets the fork. But sometimes you have to take things with a grain of salt. Tonight, we investigate everyone's favorite finale, dessert. Was cake created as one big bribe? A sinful story about a dessert named after a holy day. And surely there is nothing as American as apple pie, right? Are they just old wives' tales, ancient elixirs, or just clever marketing ploys? Every bite you take has a story, every morsel a myth. Is it baked with fact or flavored with fiction? Cake. It's a delicious symbol of celebration. But our Pilgrim Fathers would disagree. They frowned upon the food, drink, and merrymaking of celebrations. Holiday cakes were forbidden. They were too sweet and festive for days that were supposed to be holy. According to legend, it took what seems an awfully unfestive federal holiday to get cake out of the doghouse. Election Day. Did cake give rise to democracy? Who better to sift through the evidence than Matt Lewis, the dessert archaeologist?
A dessert archaeologist basically has a weird obsession with history and food and how they kind of come together. I guess you could say cake almost begins with a beginning of time. But really, the history books state it at least started with the Egyptians. Their cake was like a bread, sweetened with a little bit of honey and maybe some fruits, probably some nuts. It really isn't until about the 1600s that cake kind of came into being as we know it now, with the frosting top.
This early version of cake was English fruit cake. Dry and dense, and just too festive, according to one Oliver Cromwell, already known for banning Christmas because of its frivolity and waste.
No more cake.
He included cake in his smear campaign against everything joyful, and cake ends up being strictly forbidden.
So the Pilgrims are coming over around the same time as this whole Oliver Cromwell business is going on. The Pilgrims started to make up these holidays to celebrate. They were non-religious holidays, but they were holidays all the same to them.
The short list of holidays celebrated by the Puritan Pilgrims were college graduation day, training day for the military, Thanksgiving, and Election Day.
Boring.
Not a lot to choose from. So they made the most of Election Day.
Election Day back then was very different than what Election Day is today. Election Day was a full day of partying. It was people dancing in the streets, singing from the rafters, church sermons, people just really having a great time. Very, very different than just kind of going into a polling place, dropping your vote, and then leaving.
No one threw a better Election Day bash than Hartford, Connecticut. The wealthy, fashionable capital was one of the first to elect its own state governor. And on Election Day, it was the place to be. You could even say it took the cake. Festivities included food, drink, and most importantly, cake. The promise of a single indulgent slice brought voters out in droves. Every kitchen in Hartford was a hive of busy bakers who spent days turning out huge cakes that could feed hundreds.
Since they didn't have baking soda back then, they actually made their own yeast. They added a little flour to warm milk, stirred it together, and they would let this sit for about between 6 and 12 hours, depending on how hot the day was. They would alternate flour with their homemade yeast into this batter, a little at a time, until the batter, again, kind of comes together. It's going to be really, really stiff. The Election Day cake dough is actually closer to a bread than it is a cake. All Election Day cakes also have the addition of some type of fruit and maybe a few nuts. Most probably back then, they were made in gigantic batches, 20 by 20 size pans, whatever could go into the fire pit back then, and probably took between 2 to 3 days to make.
Politics aside, voters could agree on one proposition. Cake is always correct.
Women are using it as a way to kind of show their patriotism. They weren't allowed to vote back then, but they were allowed to make cake, obviously.
But patriotic spirit wasn't the only thing moving women to bake cakes.
Women were actually slicing it up, serving it, hoping to sway the vote in favor of their candidate. The whole idea being, if you want to vote for my candidate, I'll give you a slice of cake.
Over the years, election cakes morphed into Independence Cake, Democratic Tea Cake, Federal Cake, and Franklin Gingerbread. But after the Civil War, cake lost its power to sway voters. Elections became more local, and large patriotic gatherings disappeared. We may never know just how many elections were won or lost based on cake, but one thing's for sure, cake was a delicious influence back in the day. Nowadays, candidates tend to use campaign ads to sway voters instead of the dense decadence of election cake. And yet, election cake lives on. Today, we know it as fruitcake, a staple of celebrations like weddings, Easter, and yes, even Christmas. But there's one celebration where fruitcake just won't do. The one day when you really can have your cake and eat it too. But why do we put candles on our birthday cake? Find out next on Food, Fact or Fiction. It's a rite of passage in America, blowing out the birthday candle. And it began thousands of years ago on the other side of the world. The ancient Chinese and Greeks believed that smoke carried our prayers and wishes to heaven. But the first account of candles stuck in a cake comes to us from Germany, 1746. Protestant reformer Count Ludwig von Zinzendorf, Guten Tag, was celebrating his 46th birthday with an extravagant festival. During the celebration, he demanded 46 lit candles be placed atop his cake. The tradition spread across the world, and happy kids have been blowing out their birthday candles ever since. It's a rhapsody of flavor, delectable ice cream, hot fudge, and fresh whipped cream. But this sweet treat is forever frozen in controversy. The ice cream sundae was born out of sin. Want proof? It's all in the spelling of Sunday. Why are ice cream sundaes called ice cream sundaes? It all began in the 1800s with something called blue laws, also known as Sunday laws. These were restrictions enforced on Sundays that banned people from certain activities, like drinking alcohol or playing a game of cards. Basically, if something was fun, you couldn't do it. The purpose was to encourage people to go to church. In Evanston, Illinois, they know all about the conservative history of frosty treats. Evanston historian Eden Juron Perlman has the full scoop on how Sundays with a Y gave birth to Sundays with an E.
Blue laws are absolutely a national phenomenon, and they present themselves differently in different communities. Here in Evanston, in 1875, the town council banned soda water on Sundays.
Why? Well, doctors said the fizzy flavors were meant to be good for you, but pastors found the act of soda drinking seductive. Ice cream sodas? Sexy? What do people think of this notion today?
I do think ice cream sodas are sexy. I remember sitting at the soda fountain with my boyfriend with the 2 straws, and I thought that was like the coolest thing I'd ever done.
I can't say that I think ice cream sodas are sexy. Delicious, sure. I think ice cream sodas are very sexy. They are bubbly and frothy, and there's ice cream in them, so that's why ice cream sodas are just great.
Oh yeah, I can see what they mean. The Sunday soda ban was the last straw to Americans who had come to think of ice cream sodas as the national drink. Ice cream and syrupy soda drew crowds, especially when there was chocolate sauce involved. People of all ages would gather around soda fountains at their local drugstores to socialize and have a good time. But in Evanston, the party was over when America's favorite bubbly treat legally became a salacious symbol.
Evanston was a very religious community. Early on, it became affectionately known as Heavenston because it was a sanctified community. In 1875, the town council passed a law banning the sale of soda water on Sundays. It was considered frivolous, irreverent, sassy.
A ban on sassy? Say it ain't so. The new law did not go over well with ice cream soda lovers.
So it's a little hard to know how people in 1875 reacted to having their soda water taken away, but I think it stands to reason that they were not happy.
But then, a clever soda salesman found a loophole in the law.
Garwood's drugstore was in business between 1880 and 1894. Garwood served ice cream sodas in his store every day. Rather than break the law, Mr. Garwood decides to invent a treat that is suitable for Sunday, and he calls it the Sunday soda.
His trick? He put ice cream in a dish, poured chocolate syrup on top, and left out the forbidden soda water. Behold, the ice cream sundae. No more soda, no more sucking sounds, just blissful bites. Over time, whipped cream, nuts, and cherries were added to the mix. The ice cream sundae soon became America's frozen darling. But why was it spelled with that funny E on the end?
It was called the Sunday soda, and then later the soda portion was just dropped and it was called the Sunday. But town leaders, especially in the religious community, didn't much care for that. It was still disrespectful. So Garwood decided to change the spelling from Sunday with a Y to Sunday with an E.
Soda shops all over the country got creative and changed the Sunday spelling to Sunday, Sunday, and then simply Sunday. Of course, it wasn't long before this weekend treat started crossing counters on Mondays, Tuesdays, pretty much any day that ends in a Y.
Well over 100 years later, I think ice cream sundaes are at the top of the list of classic American desserts.
Many towns around the U.S. claim they are the birthplace of the sundae. But whoever invented this iconic delight, our taste buds, thank you. Did you know that the most famous sundae of all used to taste completely different? Discover what changed the original banana split. Next, on Food, Fact or Fiction. Did you know that one of the sweetest sundaes of all used to be even sweeter? Until the 1950s, all bananas in the U.S. were fatter, rounder, creamier, and sweeter. This bygone banana was called Big Mike. But a deadly strain of Panama disease wiped out Big Mike bananas, and the smaller, firmer, less sweet Cavendish we eat today replaced them. So, if your grandma complains that back in her day bananas were tastier, her taste buds aren't playing tricks. It's the all-American trio: baseball, mom, and apple pie. Sure, your mom may hail from Helsinki, and the rudiments of baseball may have emigrated from the cricket pitches of England, but those succulent apples, that homemade crust, that soupçon of cinnamon, nothing says America like a buttery, flaky apple pie. But is apple pie really as American as apple pie? Dessert archaeologist Matt Lewis is on a mission to uncover the apple pie's true national identity.
I personally love pie. It's like one of my favorite desserts. It's kind of one of those things that you don't feel as bad eating maybe at the end of a meal, but it's also strangely ubiquitous. There's a great pie in every corner of every state. Pie is ancient. It starts back in the Greek times. They were using pie primarily as a meat-filling type pie.
The first recorded recipe for a sweet apple pie dates back to medieval times. It appears in a 1381 tome written by the master cooks of King Richard II.
Did someone say pie?
Their recipe calls for figs, raisins, pears, and saffron, in addition to apples, flavors that still tickle our taste buds today. But a medieval pie crust was not the same kind your grandma makes.
These medieval pies aren't really pies as we know them today. The crust was way different. It was tough, almost leathery. It was actually called a coffin because it's one of those items that you would use to hold all the fillings together, but you would not eat it.
Why such off-putting shells? Because their crusts lacked butter and sugar, which were too scarce and expensive back then. Those vital ingredients didn't make the mix until the 1500s. If pie itself was invented by the Greeks, and the English were the first to add apples to the recipe, then how did apple pie become an icon of Americana? It's a story that has a rather tart beginning. When the Pilgrims arrived in America, all they found were small, sour crab apples, fruit unfit for sweet apple pie recipes.
These are apples that you would use to make cider, probably really delicious cider, but really terrible apple pie.
Europeans brought sweet apple seeds to America on the Mayflower, and they planted their first orchards near Boston in 1625. but they had to wait patiently for those seeds to yield fruit. What did they do while they waited? They drank. Eventually, sweet apple orchards swept the nation and began replacing the sour ones. Those old apple pie recipes from Europe slowly made their way into American ovens. But how did this European creation become an unquestioned symbol of American pride? Find out next on Food, Fact or Fiction. Find out the truth behind more food myths at cookingchanneltv.com/fact or fiction. Pie was invented by the Greeks, and the apples we use to make it so delicious, Granny Smith, Jonathan, Macintosh, aren't indigenous to this country. So how did it become a symbol of American pride? It began with some hard-hitting journalism.
In 1902, there's an editorial in the New York Times that talks about pie. It's a very patriotic plea to keep eating apple pie. It's all about apple pie as the symbolism of prosperity, and the people that eat pie, they love America. We can actually maybe connect this article to that whole patriotic movement of apple pie in America.
Thus was planted the idea that America and apple pie went hand in hand, a notion that World War I soldiers took to heart. At the height of the war, President Woodrow Wilson began a fundraising drive for his United War Work campaign, programs to boost soldier morale. The pitch? Help feed our soldiers slices of apple pie to keep their spirits high. The campaign was a huge success, and apple pie became America's spirit-lifting comfort food. It had become an ideal worth fighting for, even later in World War II.
The story goes, the reporters started asking men going off to World War II, "What are you fighting for?" Their answer, "Mom and apple pie."
A phrase that left a lasting impression on U.S. citizens. Just ask the pie moms of Rockland, Maine. They've been perfecting their apple pie recipe for the last 60 years.
I had 4 brothers in World War II. And I remember the slogans that you heard on the radio and you saw on the newsreels and you saw on the posters, that the young men were fighting for mom and apple pie. Because it was home, it was American.
To make a long story sweet, pie evolved through the ages and was influenced by many cultures. Sweet apples hopped the pond, and the two were married in America, becoming a symbol of our freedom. It's a love story that's as American as apple pie. We've separated food fact from food fiction, cast our votes with a slice of cake, forgiven the ice cream sundae for its sins, and discovered that while neither pie nor sweet apples were born in America, the apple pie has become a symbol of this country. It seems America has always saved room for dessert.